Stay tuned. Today's episode is brought to you by you. That's right. Every single episode created on Classic Mini DIY is made with the help of our patrons and our long-term parts sponsor, 7 Mini Parts. If you want to see more mini stuff and more videos in the future, please consider supporting the channel on patreon.com/Classic Mini DIY, or by checking out some of my awesome merch like t-shirts, stickers, and all sorts of other really cool stuff at merch.classicminidiy.com. Alright, let's get back to the episode. So, you guys might be curious, Cole, what's your engine doing back on this stand? And wait a minute, wasn't it in the car? Wasn't it running? Didn't you drive the car the other day? Well, yes, I did do all of those things, and unfortunately, I ran into an issue. And let's go into a little bit of detail about what that issue was. So, you'll see I've got my gearbox back off of my block. My engine is out of the car, much to my frustration. And the reason all of this is happening is because I have a bit of a thrust washer issue. Now, you guys might remember back, I was building this engine, and I have an episode where I actually test the thrust washer float on this, the end float on the crankshaft. Now, when measured previously, it was at 2 thou. Now, 2 thou is what the Haynes manual has as the tighter end of the spec allowed on the engines here, these A-series engines. Well, I saw that number, said it matches the Haynes manual, and moved straight on, continued on to the remainder of the build. And in this situation, 2 thou ended up being too tight. And from what I'm understanding, I've done a good bit of research on this since I started having some problems, which I'll explain in a minute. The end float that people are using these days in bog stock engines and in performance engines is at least 5 thou. Now, this is a very small amount of play in between the thrust washers and the crank, but it's so important, and it goes to show you that even the smallest measurements can be so important on these engine builds. Now, I want to say a huge thank you to a few people. They helped me diagnose this issue, they helped me figure out what I need to do here, and helped me understand the error of my ways in this build. Now, first off, I want to say a huge thank you to Turbo Mark 1 Mini. The person who built up the RTS clutch for me. I reached out to him, kind of started explaining the issues, because what ended up happening was when I pressed in the clutch, the RPMs went down a little bit. Now that's something that can happen. But what was more troubling was as the engine was getting hotter and as I drove the car down the road, things like that, once the car got up to temperature and then I pressed the clutch in, the engine was actually stalling. And what was happening was this crank was getting too much thrust, too much load put on it, and it was binding up against the thrust washers that were here in the on the main cap and the center part of the block. And that is bad, obviously quite bad. Turbo Mark 1 Mini connected me up with his friend at the car kitchen, Alex, and we had a conversation about this, and ultimately he recommended that I go ahead and pull the engine and correct the float on these thrusts, because left unchecked, left unremedied, this could cause some pretty serious issues and damage to either the crank, the block, both of those, and frankly, I want this car to run for a very long time, and I'm very comfortable with pulling the engine. As you guys know, I know that I'm going to get so much flack about pulling the engine again, but it was the right thing to do, and so I stripped down the engine on Saturday and pulled the engine out on Sunday. Took me about 2 hours to get everything off and done, which did not meet my current record, but I was pretty proud of those numbers anyway. And finally, I want to say a huge thank you to Steve Blakemore over at Turbo Cooper Sport. He's the one with the Turbocharge Mini that is just absolutely mint. It's beautiful. He has given me a ton of help throughout all of this build, and of course all the other Mini folks that are in the YouTube Mini community. Thank you everybody who's helped me so far. Now in this episode, what we're going to be doing is taking a little bit of thickness off of these standard thrust washers. Now, in some situations, you might not have to do this at all. If you have oversized thrust washers in your engine, you might be able to switch it out with standard thrusts and then allow that additional gap to open up to 5 thou. Alex over at the Car Kitchen recommended between 5 and 7 thou, so what I think I'm going to aim for is 6 thou to allow some heat expansion for those thrust washers and to allow that infloat so that I can actually drive the car and it doesn't cause me all sorts of issues. All right, so I got myself a new dial indicator here because I actually dropped my other one, much to my irritation. And so I had to get a replacement here. So I decided to go ahead and get a digital one. It's gonna make my life a little bit easier, I think. Clamps on there just like that. And you can see we've set it right on the end of the crankshaft here. And what I'm gonna do is we're gonna turn this on and we'll zero it out there. We're gonna have to zero it out again, but we're gonna take a little screwdriver. You can use a pry bar, something like that, and just go ahead and push your crankshaft in one direction fully so that we have the crank all the way in this direction here. And then we're gonna zero that out. And now what we're gonna do is measure the inflow by pressing the crank in the other direction. All right, so under load, I've got about 4 thou, but when it's resting, you can see I've got 3 thou there, about 3.5 thou actually, and that is still too tight. When this engine went together, it was set at 2 thou, as I mentioned earlier. Again, much too tight. So what we're gonna do is remove the main cap and we're gonna take the thrust washers out of here and we're gonna set them up on the bench and we're gonna slowly sand down one side of these thrust washers, so just one side of the crank here, until we get it down to the correct inflow. Now let's take these off real quick and have a look at the main cap bearing here and see how it has fared, given that there was some load issues and it was stalling and all that kind of stuff. Now if we look at the bottom side of this main bearing here, now check that out. That's some actual pretty uniform wear on those main bearings. I'm pretty pleased with that. I plan to reuse these. They're in good shape and there's no reason to get new bearings here. But we can move on to the bench and we're gonna start sanding down one side of these thrusts. So now we have the thrust washers out, and what I need to do first is measure the thickness between the two ones on the top and the two on the bottom. Get all of those thicknesses really understood so that as I sand them down, I know how much I'm taking off of them. Also, I want to make sure that the bottom thrust is the same thickness as the top one. So first thing I'll need to do is get those measured, and then we'll start sanding them. Now I'm not going to bore you with the measurements on all of these, but let's talk about how to sand the actual setup here. So I've got a few different sandpapers here, and these two are wet sand. I wish that I could have found a 200 grit wet sand, but I wasn't able to find one, unfortunately. I'm thinking that I might be able to wet this anyway. We'll see how it all works out. So the main thing we're going to be doing here is moving from 220 to 400 to 800 on the back side of these thrust washers. It's extremely important that we're going to be sanding this side of the thrust washer, not the bronze side. The bronze side is the one that goes up against the crankshaft. For some reason, somebody just insisted on one of my older videos that the bronze side was not facing the crankshaft. But I need to say with 100% clearness that the bronze side, the side with the channels on them, is the side that faces the crankshaft. It needs to be facing the moving side of your crank, which is the actual crank itself. Now, with that out of the way, we can't just sand directly on this surface right here. We need something that is perfectly flat so that we can get a nice even amount of sanding. So what I've done here, and this was a recommendation to me from Steve Blakemore, was a piece of glass. Glass is one of those surfaces that is usually perfectly flat. And we can take this, I just picked this up at the local hardware store, and we're going to take this sheet of glass here and we are going to sand on top of it. So this is going to sit just like this. A little bit of adhesive, let's flip that over. So we've got our sheet of glass here, and then what we're going to do is sheet of glass, sandpaper, and then we're going to start, and then we'll start sanding down the thrust washers. And this is going to take a little while, I have a feeling, so I won't bore you with all of that. But let's get these measured, and I'll show you guys just how I'm going to start sanding it, and then we'll jump to them being done. All right, and so within about 10 seconds of having this glass out, of course, I nicked my knuckle. Keep in mind that even a fresh pane of glass like this right out of the box, it will still gash you pretty bad, so just be careful there. Now, as you can see, I've got all of those measured, I've got my measurements there, and I've got my thrust washer here. And all of these are within about 1 thou of each other. The thickest one is at 0.093, and the thinnest one, all of the rest are at 0.092. So I need to bring about 2 thou off of this one here, and then this metal tabbed one right here that goes on the top as seen from the bottom of the engine. Then I'm going to take 1 thou off of that, and that should bring me into spec. This is going to be a kind of a long process, so I am going to skip through this. It's not very exciting, but what we're going to be doing here is simply going back and forth like this, and we're slowly going to be sanding the backside of this thrust washer off. Now I am going to also tape this glass to the table here so it doesn't move around. And keep in mind, you don't need a ton of force, just enough to get this sanding. Take your time, slow and steady wins the race on these kinds of things. All right, and so now we've spent some time sanding this down and sanding, checking, sanding, checking. So what we're gonna do is bring this back out all the way, just like that. And then we are going to run it the other direction, and let's see what our end float is. 6 thou. Exactly what we're aiming for here, which is awesome. Awesome, awesome. So basically what this took was about 3 or 4 times of disconnecting, taking the thrust washers out, sanding them, putting them back in, and checking and rechecking and checking again. This is so great. I'm so happy to see this. And what it means now is that the crank is going to have enough room for it to heat up a little bit, and for those thrust washers to heat up a little bit, and still have movement back and forth so that you can actuate the clutch without putting a load on this that would prevent it from being able to spin. So what I'm going to do is, because I've taken this on and off and torqued them on and off, what I'm going to do now is disconnect these. I'm going to disconnect these as well, and I'm going to run through and retorque the whole thing in a zigzag pattern back up to torque spec, just so I know it's right and there are no problems. But very exciting stuff. Super happy to see this at 6 thou. Moved a little bit with me tapping it, but very, very excited. All right, so that is going to wrap up this episode about correcting the thrust on the crankshaft here, and after pulling the engine and everything. You might notice that my cylinder head is also off over here. Unfortunately, I had some issues with the paint. I prepped it, primed it, and painted it. However, the paint didn't take, or it just started flaking around all of the spark plug holes. Not really sure why that happened, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to strip that down, clean it all up, and then repaint it again. Hopefully this time the paint is going to adhere and harden properly. I don't think it's the Eastwood paint specifically, because I painted my block and the block has held up perfectly. No problems there. So I'm pretty sure it has something to do with the head specifically. I'm not going to cover that in an episode. You guys have seen painting, you know how it works. 1 minute it's one color, the next minute it's another color. But I'm not quite sure what the next episode is going to be. I might have the engine all put back together and just back in the car once we're back to running again. Or I might do a little short time-lapsey thing of getting it back in the car. I also have an HIF 44 that I am going to be rebuilding, and I'm going to do a little time-lapse episode of that, just some raw, clean rebuilding and cleaning. I think that'll be pretty cool to make. And then that'll probably go up on eBay, so if anyone's looking for an HIF 44, keep an eye out for that. But anyways, that is going to wrap up this episode of Classic Mini DIY. Thank you so much for joining me, and until the next time, enjoy those minis and motor on.